Good morning, and fantastic to be here. And a big thank you to Iris for letting us talk about the trends that we're actually seeing. A couple of things, though. I mean, my interaction with the Data Breach Investigations report was actually, in many respects, where a lot of you are consumers of it. When I was at the Bank of England, and we found we were getting national, central security intelligence come to us from the likes of MI5, MI6, but that always had a particular lens on it, with really national security in mind. And it wasn't until we started to really match that with OSINT, so open source intelligence that was out there, that we really began to get a true picture of some of the things that we knew would be coming our way, and allowed us to therefore look at our security posture and adjust it. So I didn't know then that, fast forward sort of 10 years or so later, that I'm actually in the part of the organization that produces it, with the various forensic teams we have across not just Europe, but the whole globe. And it's interesting, when we talk about the contributors, there's about 90 odd contributors that come to this report from about between 80 and 90 countries around the world. But the great thing, Iris has been there since the very get-go. So the data that's coming out from Ireland comes into this report, and it's very much in the findings that I'm about to show you. But just to give you a feel of how important data is, Verizon, for example, if you contemplate global internet traffic, and how much of that goes on every day, about 72% of that is passing through Verizon infrastructure, our networks that we have globally. When you've got that level of data, that's when you can really begin to actually see what's going on out there. Because, of course, a lot of the threat community is using the internet as part of their attack frameworks. But anyway, let's get into it. It's a very big report. It's about 100 pages long. So the place I like to start with really is, what are the key things that I would want to take away from this report if I actually did spend 7 nights reading it before I go to sleep, because it wouldn't take that long. You're seeing there the volumes that we're actually talking about in terms of what the data set actually looks like. Now, the important thing here is that's double this year the size than it ever has been before. And the reason for that is we had 2 competent local authorities in Europe become data contributors. Now that's provided or created a completely new picture in a number of different areas, and it's largely associated with the mandatory reporting requirements of the likes of GDPR. But I'll come to that. So what are the 6 things? Look, ransomware. Yes, it's still there. Some people may think that it's a boring topic, that it continues to go on and on and on. But the problem is it's still there, and it's still representing about 1/3 of all of the breaches that are actually going on out there. But there's a particular issue that we've seen this year that's changed, and I'm going to come on to that in a little bit when we do a deep dive on that. We use what's called the Veris framework, for the vocabulary for event recording and information sharing, so that when we look at all of these incidents, we can essentially sort them into buckets and actually look at the different types of attacks that are actually occurring. And there's one type of attack we call system intrusion. It's the most complex, it's the most sophisticated types of attacks. I'd say 4, 5, 6 phases to it. That is actually the prevalent type of attack that's being targeted against just about every sector. You're seeing there that it's the top attack type for 7 out of the top 10. It's top 3 for all of the top 10, in fact, for all sectors. This is where we see ransomware, and the vast majority of system intrusion attacks are ransomware. But again, we're going to come back to that in a minute. We saw a real hike in the last 12 months of the threat community exploiting known vulnerabilities. Yet, mostly 0 days. 180% movement from any one year to the next is huge. When we look at the trending of the DBIR reports over history. But there's a reason, and it reminds us that when a vulnerability comes along and it plays to exactly what threat actors are looking for and wanting, they jump on it. So again, we're going to focus on that in a little bit. This is one of the main impact of what these new contributors. We've known for years that internal error. Now, what do we mean by error? Misdelivery, inadvertent, accidental sending of confidential data to a source that shouldn't get it. misconfiguration, the manual misconfiguration of the infrastructure that in itself creates a vulnerability that then gets exploited. But with the level of digital transformation we're seeing going on around the world, there's something else which is emerging through, and it's called publishing error. With the amount of data that is now appearing on either intranet sites or external-facing internet sites, we're actually seeing data being made visible that shouldn't, that's confidential. So it's not sending it anywhere, it's just merely that people can actually see it when they access these websites. So that type of stuff. For years, it's maybe been 1 in 4, 1 in 5. But with this, just from 2 competent authorities now giving us data, one of them is the ICO in the UK, it's substantially lifted and shown us the volumes of this internal error, internal risk that is actually out there. Now, you might say, okay, hang on a minute, somebody sending a little bit of data to the wrong person is hardly the same as a ransomware attack that encrypts the entire estate of an organization. This is when you've got to put the regulator hat on, because to be quite frank, the regulator doesn't necessarily care about the organization and how long it's gone down in a ransomware attack. What it does care about is the rights and remedies for third parties. And so it's far more concerned when it sees high volumes of small attritional internal error issues than actually one big ransomware attack. And that's where we see the regulators beginning to take action with these new fines and penalties that they've got available to themselves, where they see organizations continuing to have small attritional impacts that might affect an awful lot of third parties that are out there. That's when we see them stepping in and taking action. So now that we're seeing that they're beginning to get to 1 in 3, and as we get more competent authorities coming into us with their data, it's not going to surprise me if we see in maybe 2-3 years' time that internal errors are actually as much as 80% of the volume of what we're actually dealing with. And that's going to force change in our security postures. What I've just talked about, that error, is part of what we call the human element. It's a human that does something on misdelivery or publishes. But there's another dynamic when we say 2/3 of the breaches that we see involve a human element. It's that, but it's also very largely the susceptibility, of course, to social engineering, whether it's phishing, smishing, whatever it might be, that type of social engineering. We're vulnerable to that. And it succeeds certainly with AI that's coming along these days, and how incredibly realistic even ChatGPT, for example, can make a phishing email. Somebody in Korea that doesn't even speak any language in Europe, with large language capabilities, these sort of things, can find the intelligence and the capability to create a social engineering attack that will fool a very significant majority. So again, human element, very difficult really for the security infrastructure sometimes to deal with that type of dynamic of the human person. We can do something incredibly sensible one day, we do something incredibly stupid the next, for whatever reason. The final bit, and this is the one that really concerns me, the 31%, 10 years of all the breaches that we've looked at, when you see nearly 1/3 of them over 10 years continue to use stolen credentials, we call it hacking, the use of those, the criminal use of stolen credentials. Last year, it's up to 60% of the breaches involved credentials. 31% over 10 years. The message has got to be, we are not dealing with identity access management, zero trust in the way that we need to. Because there's one thing, and you'll probably hear me say this several times, a threat actor will continue to do what it does as long as it's succeeding. So for 10 years, when you see an increasing trend of using credentials, and when you actually go out there, why every organization isn't taking a weekly look on the dark web to see what is out there for sale. We did it for an organization recently in Denmark. We found 7,000 credentials, bona fide credentials that were actually out there. And they're wondering why they're getting successful attacks against them. But anyway, so they're the 10 things. But the biggest question we normally get is who's in the firing line? Who is actually getting targeted and what is actually succeeding? We have 15, but we take a look at the top 6 because they account, as you can see, for the very significant majority, about 84%. Now, public administration out there way and above everybody else, but you've got to do a bit of a deep dive and actually understand what goes into these numbers. Incidents are a security event that the organization has to deal with, but it doesn't necessarily involve a breach or is a successful attack. So that's the volume that actually organizations have to deal with. Breaches is where something successful has occurred as far as the attacker is concerned. But the vast majority of the incidents, actually, we've known for years, has DDoS. Okay? Doesn't actually involve ingress into the estate. Therefore, it doesn't usually involve the damaging type of implications we see from business email compromise or ransomware attacks. So, to me, I'm more worried about what are the type of attacks and what are the volumes that actually may result in ingress into my estate. So we have to strip DDoS out. And that top 6 reduces down a little bit to 71%. But suddenly, we can see those top 6 sectors are all now very much the same. The targeting is very, very consistent. Goes back to the statement that I said, and this is very, very similar for the last 2-3 years. Same 6 or 7 sectors. Information sector is the other one that occasionally pops in. The issue here is, back to the statement I made earlier, they continue to attack where they're being successful. So the underlying statement we have to make from this is the security capabilities within these sectors is not sufficient to deal with the volumes of attacks that are occurring because they are being successful. So when we talk about successful, okay, we got to look at the breaches. It reshuffles a little bit in terms of, who's the topmost targeted. But again, not a huge amount of differentiation between those 6 sectors. But again, we need to understand what are those volumes made up with. When I was at the Bank of England, it's what can I expect to be coming my way? All right. First thing we said, system intrusion, ransomware. 88% of the system intrusion bucket was ransomware. So we can see very, very clearly some sectors more than others, but it is a very, very significant component for just about every sector. Social engineering then comes along. Now, again, we've got to understand social engineering is used both in multiple phase attacks, but where we're seeing at the moment a real prolific rise is social engineering as the primary phase for business email compromise. Business email compromise is the fastest way that threat actors can monetize their actions. It's quicker than ransomware. We work with the US Secret Service. We were talking to them recently, and they've said 9 months ago it was about $3 million a day that they were recording globally. 3 months ago it was 6 million. It's now about 9 million. So we're seeing a prolific rise in this. And it all usually kicks off with the first phase of social engineering, but we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. There's this little bit of privilege misuse that we see for one particular sector. That's really an aberration. We don't generally get to see that. But then when we look at the grey bit, which is really everything else, it's 10-15%. So it's really difficult for organizations to say, I didn't see that coming. Because we know predominantly there's the internal error I talked about, there's ransomware, and there's an awful lot of social engineering. There's a bit of basic web application attacks that are going on as well. But actually, every organization should be able to say, right, I know what I should be expecting, and I should overlay this intelligence on my infrastructure, my security infrastructure, to say, am I fit for purpose? That's the whole point of what we do with this intelligence, is to allow organizations to ingest it, to check if they're fit for purpose. So I talked about system intrusion. This is typically what a system intrusion attack looks like. Okay, we see that social engineering dynamic. That allows them to get persistent foothold. They drop some malware, usually something like Mimikatz. That's going through a credential harvesting exercise and looking to then exfiltrate that. And at that point, the attacker completely comes away. That's it. That's done. Those first 2 phases complete. And they're then coming back in this, what I called hacking context. So it's the use of those stolen credentials. And we go, yep, hang on a minute. We've got multi-factor authentication. We should be fine. What we can tell you from what we're handling is unless you've got multiple device authentication, multi-factor authentication is easily circumvented by attackers now. There's a process, go look it up, called man in the middle. But they effectively can compromise a device. They steal essentially the cookie session as authentication process is going on, drop some more malware in there, and they've inserted themselves in that process. Easy for them. So many attacks that we actually now see, because of course still a huge volume of people working from home. This is where we see an awful lot of it going on. So they can get around that. And they're in. Then it's a question of moving laterally. And usual problem, if you've got a flat network, you're essentially just inviting the threat actor to surf all the way to wherever they want to get to. With those stolen credentials, infrastructure, it finds it very difficult to actually understand if it's a malicious user of the credentials versus the bona fide user in the first place. It's only when you see abnormal activity going on that you can possibly pick that up. If you've got a segregated network, usually threat actors will need to increase their rights and privileges of a standard user account, and that's when they risk showing themselves. If not, as I say, they can pretty much get to wherever they want to go and execute. But there's another problem. User accounts. The rights and privileges given to a standard user account is usually way beyond what a user actually needs or even knows about. That plays into the hands of threat actors. You're giving them more tools and more capabilities to go further. And so, again, another area as part of the overall zero trust that really needs to be looked at. But that's what we would have seen last year. So what's happened this year and it's back to this increase in exploited vulnerabilities and how relevant they are. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with what you can see on the slide there. Checkpoint, Ivanti, very much at that perimeter of how a threat actor is getting in. They don't need to resort to the risk side of social engineering. If a vulnerability is available to them, pretty much guaranteed they can get in and they achieve persistent foothold. So when those vulnerabilities come along, threat actors will jump on them. But it's also just the reminder of those two things there about this is the majority of the type of attacks that is actually out there. But the bulk of the exploits that we saw last year was because of a 0-day with MoveIt. Now, you've got to understand what MoveIt does. MoveIt is supposed to move confidential data within an organization safely. All right. When a vulnerability comes along and a threat actor can just insert themselves into MoveIt, they just sit there and wait because the confidential data comes to them. That's why there was a massive increase in known vulnerability exploits. So it takes us to a new point, which is, okay, so how agile is the threat community versus how agile are organizations in dealing with these vulnerabilities? Okay? The first thing we need to know is that on average, within 5 days of a new 0-day, the threat actor community is scanning to look to see who actually is susceptible. 5 days, which means that's the average. It's a hell of a lot going on in less than 5 days. What the chart that you can then see, which comes from the report, tells us, when we look at how vulnerability management goes on within an organization, and predominantly we're talking about patching here, it still takes 55 to 60 days for organizations to deal with just half the volume of vulnerabilities that are there. And if you push that out to a year, there's still just short of 10% of vulnerabilities still unremediated. So that is a massive window of opportunity for the threat actors to take advantage of, whether it's Ivanti, whether it's MoveIt, Checkpoint, whatever the vulnerability actually is. So what we don't see enough of is if organizations know they are susceptible to a particular new vulnerability, you do something about it. You make sure that your SIEM, your SOC, is powered by all of the IOCs that are known to be associated with that type of activity or vulnerability exploit for that vulnerability. You create use cases. You create playbooks so that if actually something does come along, you know exactly what you've got to do to deal with it. So many organizations just leave that unremediated window and then get surprised when an attack comes along and they're breached. Ransomware. Got to talk about this a little bit. It's this shows you the trend over time. And look, the story is, I think we all know, over that pandemic period when suddenly we had a huge volume of people working from home, the security wasn't where it needed to be for that volume of people working remotely. And the bandwidth didn't exist within organizations in their CPUs. So they did things like turn firewalls off and crazy stuff just to be able to continue trading. But it was the social engineering aspect that really threat actors played upon as the real important first stage of ransomware attacks. The security psyche of people working from home is different compared to when they're in the office. Whether it's the dog barking, babies crying, you're being there 24/7 with your partner, it messed with people's perception around security, and look, threat actors took advantage of it. But then we saw last year's report, we suddenly saw this flattening out. Suddenly flat. The DBI is a factual scientific report, so it doesn't really deal with subjective opinion. I do. All right? It's no coincidence that this occurred at the same time that suddenly the Russia-Ukraine geopolitical conflict was occurring. And what happened? Russia went hell for leather after Ukraine in cyber attacks, particularly internal infrastructure. Western world jumps up in support of Ukraine. And you've also got the NATO issue of Finland and Sweden in the mire there as well, becoming NATO members. And so Russia starts attacking all of Ukraine's friends. So Ukraine has friends who then start attacking Russia. And Russia's allies jump in support. And we end up with, for 2 years now, we've had this incredible proxy war in the threat community, where before the focus was all out there on the commercial community. Suddenly, this proxy war has occurred, and there's a huge amount of the biggest and the best threat actors bashing hell out of each other. That sucks up a lot of resource, a lot of cost. So we know that ransomware really still needs to occur, particularly from the encryption type, because that was creating funding for that actually we think was paying for a lot of the proxy war that was going on out there. But the problem becomes what happens when there's a resolution to the conflict. Proxy war, tension comes back to the commercial community. What's the ransomware line going to do then? We fast forward and we see what's happened in this year's report, and it takes a little bit of explaining. The blue line is really everything that we actually see. The green line is a separate type of ransomware that we're seeing, not encrypting and extorting from encryption, stealing data and extorting from stolen data. Threat actors are finding that embarrassing organizations, by giving that data into the public domain, give it to the media, give it to the regulators, plaster it publicly so that all the customers can see that their data is actually out there. The impact to reputation, the impact to capital, share price, we know organizations are now preferring to pay that type of extortion when they wouldn't pay an actual encryption to get the decryption key back. So we're seeing a new trend. And so the orange piece you can see is what has really now emerged as a new trend for ransomware. Anyway, need to move on. Really, this trend line shows you that in the past we used to have different attack types that were sort of roller coastering one year, another one the next. But actually, suddenly, last 2 or 3 years, again, this incredible consistency of the type of attacks that are occurring. Now, we've got to explain the blue and orange line versus the dip in the yellow line. This chart is a percentage of whole. All of it adds up to 100%. When you see the increases in the likes of error because of the new contributors that we've got, and we see the increase that we're showing there on social engineering because of business email compromise, when we see those increases, something else has to give. Or in other words, something else is a smaller proportion, and that's what explains the basic web application attacks. They're still going on, but there's just more of social engineering and more of error that is actually pushing that line up. But then we need to explain the system intrusion line staying flat, because if other things are going up and system intrusion is holding its own on a flat line, it actually means it's going up. To hold your own in these circumstances, there is increases. But again, the whole point of this is incredible consistency over the type of attacks against just about every sector. So look, just getting close to the end here. What I wanted to show you, I've shown you the 6, but really this is across all of the industry sectors. And when we pick out those techniques or types of attacks that are occurring across all of the industry sectors, you can see everything I've been talking about, particularly as far as system intrusion is concerned, business email compromise with social engineering. They're there. So it's just the volumes that are going on. Every sector is experiencing the same thing. So it's right back to what I said at the beginning, which is, how can you not see what's coming your way? Got to be ready for these type of techniques, the TTPs, tools, techniques, procedures that the threat actors are using. You've got to overlay that on the security infrastructure. Usually the best way of doing it, how Verizon does it, we look at our security controls relative to the TTPs and say, what controls especially need to be really fit for purpose to deal with the type of attacks we know are coming our way. And when you've done that, we do a ragging exercise, particularly focused on where we know we're going to see that malicious activity. So, and look, there's the 6. It's just that, they're just larger numbers than the others. So really wrapping up, back to what I said right at the beginning. What are the takeaways? If you're not ready as an organization to deal with ransomware, you need to get yourself sorted out. Whether you've got a playbook, whether you've simulated it with your execs, because these are very, very critical decisions, of course, that boards are having to make in an uncomfortable situation when they don't have an awful lot of information available to them. But the fact is, it's there, it's increasing, you've got to be ready for it. Error. It's a problem. It's now 1 in 3, nearly 1 in 3, and that's really the underlying current. It's more than that. Regulators will begin to pick up on this, and they'll begin to be having discussions with organizations where they see consistent volumes of internal error going on. And there's plenty of organizations that are out there across Europe now that have felt the pain of tens of millions of fines that the regulators are now giving. CVEs. If you've got an exploit, be ready for it. You may not be able to remediate it immediately. Get ready for it. Understand the IOCs to look for, to say someone is actually about to or has exploited it. Create the use cases, whatever you need to, within your SIEM, your SOC. Getting ready is the most critical part that actually isn't happening. The fuzzy dots, it's just saying system intrusion is everywhere. It is the most prolific thing. It's happening to everybody. Okay, and it is succeeding. It is the most successful type of attack. So again, get ready to deal with multiple phase. Know what are the TTPs relative to each phase, and if you see something, you can tell what part of the phase of the attack it actually is, how mature it is. Whether if you're seeing something that's got lateral movement, you're very, very close. Now, the final thing you need to say about things like ransomware. For as much as organizations can bring in things like forensics, and we can try to look and see what's going on and what we can see the threat actors doing, it's a two-way window. If we deploy collection scripts for evidence, the threat actor can see that. They know, and we reckon on average, if a threat actor sees that forensics has been deployed, that they've probably got 3 hours, no more, to execute their plan. So in the minute they see forensics within the environment, may not have got as far as they ideally would have wanted to, but they know containment will mean there'll be access or the affected infrastructure will effectively be ring-fenced, made remote. That cuts the head off the threat actor. They know they can't do anything. So you've got about 3 hours to actually make a decision, like taking your global infrastructure offline. And we find organizations just don't know how to do that, or don't even know who has the authority to do that within 3 hours. So big problem. Oops, sorry. Human element, I don't think I need to say anything more about that. They play upon it. Threat actors play upon the human element because we're unreliable. Okay? We can do as much training as we like, but it's vital. It's vital that we get a security consciousness within employees to try to help this. And the final thing is look back to the credentials. One takeaway, if you do anything as an organization, go look on the dark web to see if your credentials are out there. It's one of the cheapest services that vendors actually offer, 25, 30,000 a year, to have a weekly report that not just tells you what credentials are out there, what typo squatting is going on, what is the chat room, what's threat actor chat room mentions of your organization, are we being targeted? Such a simple service that provides so much intelligence for you to react upon. But anyway, that's really, it's a very, very quick walk through what we're seeing, the trends we're seeing. The report's nearly, the data for the report is nearly a year old, but everything I've told you is what we're seeing still on a day-to-day basis. And the next report's coming out in May next year. So at that point, throw it open for, if we've got time for any questions. Any question? Yeah, please.
So when you say 0 days,
yeah.
not 0 days at the point that the mass exploitation starts.
No. So a 0 day is just a terminology that's given to a brand new vulnerability that nobody actually knew existed previously. Generally, in the public, all right, certainly within the threat community, it tends to be a little bit more known, but you only find out about it because it's been exploited. Okay? But it's
being exploited before you find out about it. And that's when it's a 0 day. After that,
it's a known exploit.
It's a known exploit.
Yeah.
It might be a fresh baby exploit, but it's not a 0 day.
Look, you're arguing with the term that's been given to something. Okay, the whole of the cyber community understands that a 0 day is something that has happened for the first time that nobody knew about before. That's the reference that they give to it. Now, we can argue why they call it a 0 day, but it's just the terminology that's given to it. Okay? Yeah. One more. Is that okay? Malicious, no. So maliciously sending data, for example, to a journalist or something like that, it's a very, very, very small component. All right, and no, we're not seeing any particular increase in that at all. Okay, if that's okay, Gordon, thank you.